The young train engineer Daniel was accustomed to Siberia's harsh landscapes, where endless snowy plains stretched to the horizon, merging with the gray winter sky. He came from a family of railroad workers, where the profession was passed down like a sacred legacy. His father, who had worked on the railways for 35 years, and his grandfather, who began his career in the post-war era, didn't just teach him how to operate locomotives. They instilled in him a near mystical reverence for the steel arteries cutting through the Taiga. After graduating from technical school in the regional center, where the noisy urban bustle only deepened his longing for home, Daniel returned without hesitation to the small depot on the outskirts of a remote village nestled deep in the forests. He started as an assistant engineer on shunting locomotives, but his innate intuition and diligence quickly earned his colleagues' respect. Within 2 years, he was entrusted with solo freight runs, massive steel beasts hauling hundreds of tons across Siberia. Each trip was a small adventure, a chance to witness the ever-changing beauty of the wilderness. He especially loved winter routes, when the snow-blanketed expanses glittered under the low sun and frost painted intricate crystalline patterns on the cabin windows like scenes from a fairy tale. But on that January day, with temperatures plunging below 30 degrees and fresh snow covering the tracks, something happened that would forever alter his understanding of the world he knew. The train Daniel was operating that day was a long chain of loaded freight cars linked by heavy couplers. The locomotive, a powerful machine with worn but reliable mechanics, hummed steadily as it climbed a snow-covered incline. Standing at the control panel, Daniel scanned the instruments with a practiced eye: brake pressure normal, coolant temperature stable, electrical current steady. Outside, familiar scenery flashed by: ancient firs bowed under snowdrifts, a frozen river locked in thick ice, occasional animal tracks crossing the rail embankment. About 3 kilometers ahead, where the tracks curved around a rocky outcrop, his attention snagged on an unusual dark spot. At first, he thought it might be a fallen branch or a snowdrift left by recent winds. But as the distance closed, the shapes grew clearer, and within a few hundred meters, he realized with a jolt that several large figures stood motionless on the tracks. His pulse quickened. These were animals, and their behavior defied all logic for wild taiga dwellers. As the train neared, Daniel counted at least 7 large animals, their gray-white forms stark against the snow. Wolves, adults with thick winter coats that made them appear even more imposing. They stood in a tight line across the rails, none showing signs of alarm despite the approaching roar of the train. Daniel's training kicked in. Standard procedure demanded a warning signal, followed by emergency braking if the obstacle remained. His hand moved automatically to the horn lever, and a piercing blast shattered the icy silence, echoing through the forest. Normally, such a sound would send any wildlife fleeing. Even bears, known for their stubbornness, retreated from the noise. But these wolves merely lifted their heads, unmoving as if rooted to the ties. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Old engineers' tales flashed through his mind, stories of ghostly lights drifting along the tracks, phantom steam engines in the fog, animals behaving unnaturally. But this was no time for superstition. A multi-ton train was hurtling toward a living barricade, and he had seconds to decide. The gap closed rapidly. Daniel knew even emergency braking wouldn't stop the heavy freight train instantly. It needed at least 600 meters to halt, and the wolves were barely 400 meters away. Instinct urged him to keep going, trusting the animals would scatter at the last moment. But something in their stance, their unnatural stillness, their almost knowing gaze, made him hesitate. Gritting his teeth, he yanked the brake lever. Metal shrieked against metal, smoke billowed from the wheels, and the entire train shuddered violently. Daniel gripped the controls, feeling the locomotive fight against the momentum of hundreds of tons. His body braced for impact. He could already imagine steel meeting flesh, the horrific crunch of bones under wheels. Yet, impossibly, the train ground to a stop just 3 meters from the pack. Silence fell, broken only by the creak of cooling machinery. Daniel, dazed, stared at the wolves, expecting them to bolt. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The pack didn't flee. Instead, they slowly parted, forming a corridor down the center of the tracks. Their movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Only then did Daniel see what made his blood run cold. A man lay on the rails, an elderly figure in tattered winter gear, his arms wrenched along the tracks, secured by handcuffs. Even from a distance, Daniel saw the metal glinting in the weak light. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror and something else relief. Daniel grabbed a wrench from the cabin, in case the wolves turned aggressive, and stepped onto the snow. The crunch under his boots seemed deafening in the stillness. The wolves didn't approach, but held their ground in a semicircle, watching with unblinking yellow eyes. Up close, Daniel recognized the man, Stephen Mitchell, the local game warden famous for his relentless fight against poachers. In his 70s, but usually robust, Stephen now looked frail, his lips blue from cold. As Daniel bent to inspect the cuffs, the old man whispered something unintelligible, but his eyes held gratitude beneath the pain. The cuffs were chained directly to the rails, with no key in sight. Daniel fetched bolt cutters from the locomotive, and as he worked, the wolves stood sentry. Only when the chain snapped and Stephen was freed did they melt into the forest, their duty done. Back in the cabin's warmth, Stephen recounted his ordeal. Poachers, enraged by his interference, had ambushed him during patrols, knocked him unconscious, and chained him to the tracks, taunting that a freight train would settle things. He'd resigned himself to death until he heard the wolves. Not attacking, not fleeing, but standing guard over him as the train approached. The same pack he'd protected for years, now returning the favor. The story spread like wildfire. The poachers were caught. One turned informant, terrified after being stalked by unseen wolves. Locals shared older tales, how wolves once led Stephen to a poacher's trap, how a she-wolf brought her injured pup to his cabin. But the railroad incident became legend. Daniel, passing that curve ever since, would slow down and watch the tree line. Once he glimpsed them, gray shadows observing the train. The Alpha's gaze locked with his, and in that moment, Daniel knew. Years passed. Daniel became a mentor. Stephen kept patrolling with a wolf hybrid dog found near the tracks. The poachers? Some quit hunting, haunted by nightmares of yellow eyes. Stranger still, no animal was ever hit by trains on that stretch again. Workers swore on foggy nights. Shadowy figures paced the rails. Guardians. Now, approaching the curve, Daniel would tap the horn, not a blast, but a soft call. Sometimes, just maybe, a howl answered through the trees. Not a threat. A reminder. To the new engineers, Daniel would say, tracks aren't just steel and wood. They're alive. And if you listen, they'll tell stories wilder than any fairy tale. Then, gazing at the forest, out there, you're the guest. And you'll never guess who the real host is.